He gripped his phone tightly, his hands trembling. The message had been written moments earlier, but he hesitated to send it. "I'm divorcing you." This simple yet harsh sentence carried the weight of months of agony, doubt, and sleepless nights. She was at a party, laughing and drinking in another man's arms, while he, the betrayed husband, waited in silence, ready to end it all. He knew exactly where she was, every laugh, every touch captured in recent months. It wasn't mere suspicion, it was a betrayal he had been tracking daily, silently stoking his anger until it became unbearable. Deep down, he questioned why her. Why had the woman he built a life with, the one he dreamed of a future with, chosen someone else? At first he tried to dismiss the signs, the frequent absences, the flimsy excuses, the hollow looks when they were together. But the emptiness she left in their bed, at the dinner table, and in their conversations about the future could no longer be ignored. Her betrayal was a constant shadow, hanging over every quiet moment they shared. He wanted to believe it was just a phase, that she would return to him, but over time he understood that she had been gone long before she walked out that night. Now, everything was about to change. With his finger poised over the send button, he pictured her reaction to those words. The pain he felt would now be hers. It wouldn't just be a message, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would pay for every lie, every fake smile, every touch meant for someone else. He took a deep breath and pressed send. Time seemed to freeze, and almost immediately he saw the message had been read. His heart pounded. Would she cry, try to call, or worse, was she with her lover as she read his farewell? The phone buzzed again. He imagined her, phone in hand, sitting in a dim corner of the party, struggling to hold back tears while her lover remained oblivious, or perhaps reveled in her misery. Would this be her last memory of their marriage, the party, the lover, and the message that shattered her life? He briefly wondered if it was enough. Would she feel the same intense pain he did? He wanted her to know everything, the months he had watched her, the times he pretended to be ignorant. He wanted her to feel the weight of his betrayal in every word of that message, echoing in her mind like a final verdict. Another vibration from his phone. No reply, just silence, a heavy, overwhelming void. The message had been received, but was she still with him, or was she torn between staying with her lover or salvaging what was left of her life? He pictured her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands gripping her phone as the loud music and laughter of the party faded into the background. What did she feel now, guilt, remorse, or the same indifference she had shown in recent months? A new, unsettling thought entered his mind, a question he had been avoiding. What would she do next? Would she come home, begging for forgiveness, or vanish with her lover, abandoning the life they had built together? He stared at his phone, the silence on the other end more suffocating than any response. The emptiness that once consumed him was now filled with something new, revenge mixed with a yearning for answers he might never get. The phone stayed silent, but in the back of his mind, another doubt was brewing, one he couldn't ignore. What if her betrayal had deeper consequences than he ever imagined? The silence between them hinted at something far more profound, something he had never considered. The quiet inside the house was almost oppressive, a stark contrast to what it used to be, a place filled with laughter, conversation and dreams. The once welcoming home, with its bright walls and minimalist decor, now felt cold and hostile. Every corner seemed to hold memories that grew more distant and painful each day. The space was immaculate, but devoid of life or presence. John and Emily had been what many called the perfect couple. They met in college, dreaming of successful careers and a prosperous life. John, always focused and determined, pursued a career in finance, building a strong path in a major company. His work ethic was commendable, but over the years, his dedication to his job consumed much of his time. Emily, more sensitive and lively, chose a creative path as a graphic designer, spending her days filled with art, while John's were dominated by numbers and reports. Their marriage, built on years of love and companionship, seemed unshakable at first glance. They had a large house, frequent vacations, and dinners with friends. But as appearances maintained the illusion of perfection, something began to crumble between them. In the early years, conversations flowed easily. They shared dreams, frustrations, joys, and the little details of everyday life. But as John climbed the corporate ladder, his late nights at the office became more common. Emily filled her time with new art projects and gallery openings, finding solace in expressing her unease. The growing distance between them was barely noticeable at first. hidden behind commitments and responsibilities. But gradually the space widened, and words that once came naturally were replaced by longer and longer silences. John loved Emily, he was sure of that, but the routine and work overshadowed the small gestures that had once been a daily part of their life. The flowers he used to buy on Fridays, the spontaneous breakfasts, the late-night chats about anything, all of it faded without him even realizing. And Emily, patient and understanding as she was, deeply felt his absence. Emily found herself increasingly alone in a house that no longer felt as inviting as it once did. Occasionally she would try to rekindle the past, a candlelit dinner, a surprise with wine and music, but John was always too tired, his mind elsewhere, constantly assuring her he'd make it up on the weekend, promises that were rarely fulfilled. Emily would smile, trying to be understanding, but deep down she knew something important was slipping away, something she couldn't figure out how to regain. The gap wasn't physical, they were in the same house, shared the same bed, the same roof, but it no longer felt like they were living the same life. John wasn't unkind or heartless, on the contrary, he cared deeply for Emily. But the pressures of work and the pursuit of financial security seemed to justify his emotional absence. He convinced himself he was doing the right thing by securing a stable future for them both. However, what he failed to see was that this perfect future seemed meaningless without Emily's true presence. Meanwhile, Emily tried to fill the emptiness. Sometimes she buried herself in her work, losing herself in colors, shapes, and designs. Other times, she made efforts to revive the love that once made her believe nothing could tear them apart. Yet, as the months passed, the feeling of loneliness only deepened, and she found herself reflecting on the past, wondering when everything began to shift. John still looked at Emily with affection, but the passion in his eyes had faded. It was as if they were caught in a limbo, where life continued, but the love that bonded them was slowly disappearing. Close friends noticed the change. Emily's laughter was less frequent, and John was always too preoccupied to attend social gatherings. When they were out together, an unspoken discomfort hung between them, an invisible wall neither knew how to dismantle. Conversations about mundane topics replaced any attempt to address what truly mattered, and when silence fell, it was as if they were both waiting for the other to say something that could mend the unseen wound between them. Over time, Emily began to pull away. What had once been an effort to reconnect transformed into a quest to find peace within herself. She threw herself into her projects, spent more time outside the home, and occasionally avoided coming back for dinner. John noticed her growing distance, but he was so entangled in his own responsibilities that he brushed it off as just another phase, one he believed would pass with time. But phases have limits, and despite their attempts to pretend their love was intact, the truth was that wear and tear had already formed cracks, small, almost invisible, but enough to make the distance between them a new reality. One evening, as Emily prepared to go out again, John watched her, trying to recall how it all began, how he had fallen in love with the woman with the bright smile and dreamy eyes. He wondered if there was still a chance to save something. But Emily had already let go of any hope for change. And so, two lives that were once perfectly intertwined began to unravel quietly. They continued their routines and commitments, but what was once shared became solitary and individual. The gap between John and Emily widened, and without realizing it, they each made choices that would forever alter the course of their marriage. The weeks that followed were a blur for John. He maintained his relentless schedule, long hours at the office, returning to a house filled with an overwhelming silence. Emily, on the other hand, grew increasingly distant, spending less time at home. When they were together, their conversations were limited to the bare minimum. John sensed something was off but refused to confront the truth. Deep down, he knew things were wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. After all, he had invested so much into building their life. Failure was simply not an option. Emily, however, had already given up trying to fix things. She wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, her desire to fight for her marriage faded. Maybe it was John's neglect, or perhaps it was something deeper. All she knew was that she had found comfort where she shouldn't have. At first, it was just brief conversations, a harmless flirtation. But what began as exchanged glances and laughter gradually became something she couldn't control. She met him during an art exhibition, on one of those nights John had promised to attend but cancelled last minute, citing work as the reason, as always. Emily wasn't surprised, but for the first time she felt liberated, free from the expectation of John's presence, from the weight of his absence. That night, she met David, tall, charming, with a smile that seemed to see every part of her John had overlooked. He was different from anyone she had ever known. Their conversations flowed effortlessly, starting with art and eventually touching on life. David was witty, engaging and, most importantly, attentive. He listened to Emily, really listened, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. It didn't take long for their attraction to become undeniable, a desire Emily tried to suppress, but which only grew with each meeting. What was initially a harmless friendship quickly evolved into more. Emily knew she was crossing boundaries that couldn't be undone, but the feeling of being seen and desired was impossible to resist. John, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware. He noticed her frequent absences, of course, but chose not to question them. In his mind, they were simply going through a rough patch. He clung to the belief that their love, no matter how strained, was strong enough to endure anything. He convinced himself that with a little more patience, things would eventually return to normal. But the distance between them was no longer a temporary phase, it was their new reality. As Emily's outings became more frequent, she always had a reason: work meetings, catching up with friends, or a new exhibition. John accepted her excuses without probing, sometimes even feeling relieved not to confront the emptiness at home. Deep down, he knew something was amiss, but avoiding the pain seemed the only viable escape. One particular night, while John was buried in office reports, Emily was getting ready to go out once more. She put on a red dress she hadn't worn in ages, carefully styled her hair, and looked at herself in the mirror. Something felt off about her preparations. For a brief moment, she questioned her choices, but quickly shoved aside any trace of guilt. David was waiting, and she chose to ignore the consequences. Arriving at the gallery, where David awaited, Emily felt a mix of excitement and nerves. He greeted her, as always, with a warm smile that made her forget everything else. The evening unfolded with conversations, laughter, and a growing closeness that hinted at what was to come. Emily was fully aware of her actions, of the line she was crossing, but she chose to ignore the inner voice urging her to stop. When the night finally ended, she didn't go home. Meanwhile, John was still at the office, unease gnawing at him, sensing something was wrong that night, more than usual. Maybe it was the overwhelming silence in the house when he left, or perhaps it was the distant look in Emily's eyes the last time they saw each other. He glanced at his watch again. It was late, and Emily still hadn't called. Worry began to flood his mind, accompanied by a surge of anger. It was a rage that seemed to arise from nowhere, growing stronger with each passing minute. When John finally decided to leave work and head home, his thoughts were already spinning with scenarios he didn't want to believe. When he arrived, he was met with emptiness. Emily was gone. He called her, but there was no response, and his anger intensified, fueled by the doubts and mistrust he had been pushing aside for months. He grabbed his keys and left again, determined to find her, even though he had no idea where to begin. Meanwhile, Emily was with David at a party. They laughed and drank, unbothered by the world outside. Yet, deep down, Emily knew she couldn't avoid reality forever. She felt the burden of her choices, but at the same time, she was caught up in this newfound sense of freedom. Then her phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her bag, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw John's name on the screen. She knew she couldn't ignore him indefinitely, but right then, all she wanted was to escape her old life, even if only for a few more hours. With a heavy heart, she put her phone away, trying to savor the fleeting moments before reality would inevitably catch up. Across town, John finally arrived at the gallery and froze when he saw Emily's car parked outside. Standing there, his body shook not just from anger, but from the deep anxiety that had been brewing for months. He had sensed something was wrong, but now he was about to face his worst fears. Each step toward the entrance felt like a battle within himself, one part of him wanting to run and pretend it was all a lie, and the other part, weary of denial, urging him forward. As he stepped into the crowded gallery, the noise of conversations and music faded into the background. His eyes were searching for one person: Emily. He weaved through the crowd, strangers chatting and smiling, unaware of the storm about to unfold. Then he saw her, tucked in a corner of the room with a man John had never met, but whose connection to Emily was unmistakable. They were talking, laughing, sharing an intimacy John hadn't felt in his own marriage for what seemed like ages. His stomach dropped, and everything appeared to slow down. He clenched his phone tightly in his pocket, as if the mere touch could calm the turmoil inside him. He watched as the man placed his hand on Emily's back, and she responded without hesitation. a gentle smile on her face. This was the confirmation John never wanted, right there in public, with strangers around. Emily, his wife, was sharing herself with someone else. But it wasn't the act that hurt the most, it was the look on Emily's face when she finally noticed him. Emily's eyes widened, her face losing all color, and the conversation with the man beside her abruptly halted. In an instant, the fantasy she had been living clashed with reality. For a moment, they both stood frozen, staring at each other, as if the entire world had vanished. Emily was speechless, and John wasn't sure if he had the strength to confront her right then and there. The silence between them was louder than any words could be. Slowly, John approached, his steps heavy, as if he were walking toward his own doom. He didn't speak immediately, he didn't know how to begin. But Emily's pale, silent expression told him everything. She knew she was exposed. Her betrayal, which she had hidden behind flimsy excuses and countless nights out, was now undeniable. "So this is it," John finally spoke, his voice low but laden with pain. It was barely steady, and his simple question conveyed all he needed to understand. There was no shouting, no outburst, just the hollow emptiness of a man watching his world collapse. Emily swallowed and glanced at the man beside her, who looked uncomfortable but remained motionless. She struggled to find words, some kind of explanation, but nothing came. What could she possibly say? What justification could there be? "John," she began, her voice weak and barely audible. They both knew there was nothing to explain. John stepped back, as if he needed space to breathe. Emily's words stung, but it was her silence that hurt most. She didn't apologize, didn't attempt to deny it. She just stood there, fully aware that everything was laid bare. John felt the crushing weight of their fractured relationship settle on his shoulders. "I knew it," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Around them, the gallery continued unchanged, people carrying on with their lives, oblivious to the drama unfolding. But John felt suffocated by the loneliness he had always refused to acknowledge. Emily's infidelity wasn't just a matter of being with another man, it confirmed that he had been abandoned long before he ever realized. Emily cautiously moved closer, as if seeking a way to repair what was broken, but John's stare stopped her. He didn't want to hear excuses. There was no apology in the world that could erase what he had just seen. "I can explain," Emily tried again, her voice filled with guilt and fear. But John was already too far removed to listen. He took another step back, distancing himself not just physically but emotionally. In that moment, he finally accepted what he had been avoiding for so long. Their marriage was over. The betrayal wasn't just an act, it was the shattering of all the promises and dreams they had once built together. "No, you can't," John interrupted sharply. He knew that any explanation she offered would be a futile attempt to soften the blow, and he was done listening. The man beside Emily remained silent, seemingly aware that his presence was irrelevant now. What mattered was the bond that had been irrevocably broken between John and Emily. John felt the weight of their shared past, the happy moments. The life they had created, all of it felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Slowly he turned away, ready to leave. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to salvage. As John walked toward the exit, his phone vibrated in his pocket. For a split second he thought of ignoring it, but something made him pause and check the screen. It was a message from Emily, and the few words she sent would change everything. "I'm pregnant." John stood frozen, staring at the message on his phone. The words seemed to blur before his eyes, making no sense in that moment. Pregnant. Emily was pregnant. He glanced over at her, still beside David, her gaze fixed on her own hands, too afraid to meet his eyes. The weight of those words crushed everything he thought he knew, his anger, the pain of her betrayal. All of it was suddenly overshadowed by a new reality he wasn't prepared to face. Pregnant. That one word changed everything. He moved closer, his steps now heavy with uncertainty. Emily looked up, realizing he had seen the message. The silence between them thickened, now filled with a tension John didn't know how to handle. As John attempted to speak, his words faltered, and a lump formed in his throat, a mix of shock and bewilderment. The anger that had fueled him was now replaced by a profound fear of what lay ahead. "How did this happen?" he asked, almost as if speaking into the emptiness. Emily stepped forward, inhaling deeply as she gathered the courage to respond. "I found out recently. I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice frail, as if it could shatter at any moment. She understood that this revelation altered everything, but not in a way that could mend what was broken. John looked down, struggling to process the information. He was lost, unsure of how to feel. The thought of Emily being pregnant, of having a child with her, was something that once would have brought him immense joy. But now, tangled in the web of her betrayal, it felt like an emotional trap from which he couldn't escape. "Who is it?" he finally asked, his voice colder than he intended. It wasn't just a question born of curiosity, it was a desperate need to know whether this child was his, or if Emily had betrayed him in every way imaginable. Emily hesitated, her breath catching in her throat, knowing this was the unavoidable question and that any answer would be painful. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking under the weight of the truth she could barely accept herself. "I'm not sure." John felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. The question of paternity was a torment he had never imagined facing. He locked eyes with Emily, who was now on the brink of tears, and for a brief moment he grasped how heavy this was for her too. But any sense of empathy was quickly swallowed by anger. He couldn't believe he was now the man who didn't even know if his wife's child was his. David, standing beside Emily, took a step back, visibly uncomfortable. He understood that his presence was a glaring reminder of the betrayal and perhaps the uncertainty surrounding the child's paternity. Yet John couldn't even bring himself to look at David. His focus was solely on Emily, the woman he thought he knew, but who now felt like a complete stranger. John remained silent for a long time after Emily's confession. The room seemed to spin around him, yet he felt utterly immobilized, weighed down by the gravity of everything that had transpired. His mind couldn't fully grasp what this all meant. It wasn't just about Emily's infidelity, but the torturous doubt over the child she carried. That uncertainty was tearing him apart in ways he never thought possible. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts, but the pain was unrelenting. Emily watched him, waiting for some response, any word that could break the silence, but John was lost, not knowing where to begin. Part of him wanted to flee, to leave everything behind, yet another part was stuck, ensnared by the possibility that the child might still be his. He couldn't simply dismiss that chance. "I didn't know how to tell you," Emily repeated, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just remorseful for the betrayal but also for the chaos that now engulfed them both. The future they had envisioned was shattered, replaced by a barrage of unanswered questions. John closed his eyes momentarily, trying to block out everything around him. He craved time and space to think, to make sense of what was happening, but Emily's words, the anguish in her voice, the weight of the betrayal, they all struck him like a blow. Inside, there was a storm of anger, confusion, and a lingering love that, despite the pain, still existed in some small way. "You're not sure?" John finally asked, his voice low and filled with disbelief. It was a simple question but carried enormous emotional weight. He wasn't just asking about the child's paternity, he was questioning the very foundation of their relationship and how they had ended up here. Emily slowly shook her head. "I wanted to believe it was yours, but I can't be sure. Not after everything." Her honest confession, though truthful, hurt him even more. John felt betrayed, not only by her actions but by the lack of certainty, the doubt now looming over everything. A physical betrayal was one thing he could have possibly healed from that over time, but the ambiguity about the child, about what Emily truly felt, was something he wasn't sure he could forgive. "And what did you expect?" John asked, his tone now laced with bitterness. "That I'd just accept this? That I'd look at you and pretend everything's fine?" Emily bit her lip, struggling to find the right words. She knew that nothing she said could undo what she had done. The only thing she could offer now was honesty, even if it caused more pain. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I was confused, alone. I made a mistake. But I love you, John." I always have. Silence enveloped them once more. John stared at her, but he no longer recognized the woman before him. She was the same person he had loved, yet at the same time, she felt completely foreign. Her professed love sounded hollow amid all they had lost. "But love?" John scoffed bitterly, taking a step back. "Is this love to you, Emily? Lying, hiding, letting me believe we still had a chance?" Tears streamed down Emily's face, her shoulders shaking. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. I just didn't know how to stop." John felt his anger surge again, but this time it wasn't the fiery rage he had felt when he first saw her with another man. It was deeper, more contained, born from the sense of emotional betrayal that consumed him. He looked at her, the woman he had vowed to spend his life with, and realized that something within him had irrevocably changed. Maybe it's changed forever. It's not just about what you did, John finally said, his voice cold but steady. It's about what you've destroyed. You broke the trust, the respect. I might have been able to forgive the affair, Emily, but this uncertainty about the baby, I don't know if I can live with that. His words hung heavily in the air between them. Emily was at a loss. Nothing she could say would undo what she had done, and now all that remained was the uncertainty of the future. She knew John was heartbroken and that he had every right to be angry, but she also couldn't shake the fear of losing him completely. Despite everything, she still loved him, but her love now felt inadequate. John turned his head, unable to keep looking at her like this. He realized the choice he was facing would be the hardest of his life, and he knew that regardless of what he decided, his world as he knew it was over. The question was, what would he do next? What was left for him now that everything he had once believed in had crumbled? The moral conflict consuming him was immense. Could he accept the situation and try to rebuild, knowing that the child Emily was carrying might not be his? Or would he walk away, sever all ties, and start anew without her? These were questions he couldn't answer yet. All John knew was that he needed space, he needed air, time to sort out his thoughts. John took a step back, his eyes locked on Emily for a moment before he slowly turned away. He had to leave, to clear his mind, to breathe, and maybe, in the process, figure out what to do with what remained of his heart. The days that followed were filled with a deafening silence. John didn't come home that night. He needed distance, a break from everything he knew. Emily's revelation had torn him apart, leaving him reeling from the inside out. The doubt, the betrayal, and the realization that his entire life had unraveled kept him in a state of emotional suspension. He roamed the streets, avoiding people, avoiding even the thought of dealing with the aftermath. Emily, on the other hand, was left alone in the house where they had once built a life together. The silence within those walls echoed her mistakes, mistakes she could never undo. Regret consumed her, but what haunted her most was the uncertainty of what lay ahead: the baby, the unknown future, the possible loss of John. All of it blended together, making every day feel like endless torment. John remained gone for weeks, each day a struggle to figure out his next move. The idea that the baby Emily carried could belong to another man was unbearable, but there was a part of him that couldn't completely sever his ties to her. The love he felt, though strained and battered, still lingered. After weeks of inner conflict, John finally made up his mind. He returned to the house and found Emily sitting in the living room, the same spot where they had shared countless laughs, dreams, and plans. Now, the room was thick with an almost suffocating tension. Emily slowly rose when she saw him, fear evident on her face. She knew that whatever John decided now would determine their future. John looked at her for a long time before speaking. His voice was calm, but there was a finality to it that Emily had never heard before. "I can't keep living like this," he began, his words slicing through the quiet like a knife. "I've thought about everything, what we were, what we might still be, but I can't live with this doubt. I can't look at you, at this baby, and constantly wonder if he's mine." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she tried to speak, but John cut her off. "I'm not here for excuses or explanations. That part is over. What we had ended when you decided to hide everything from me. I loved you, Emily, I really did, but you broke that in ways I don't think can be repaired." The pain on Emily's face was clear, but John stood firm. He felt compelled to bring closure to this chapter of his life once and for all. "I'm filing for divorce, and you'll move on with your life. I hope, for your own peace of mind, you find out who the father of this child is. But I can't be a part of this anymore. I can't live in this uncertainty." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Emily broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, but John didn't waver. His decision was made, and he knew it was the only way forward that made sense for him. The days that followed were swift and impersonal. The divorce went through with little conflict, and John distanced himself completely from the life they had once shared. He started over in another city, far from the memories that held him captive. It wasn't an easy transition, but each day the burden lightened, little by little. Emily, on her part, chose to go ahead with the pregnancy. A few months later, she learned that the baby wasn't John's, confirming that her path was now completely separate from his. She raised the child alone with support from her family, but the regret over the betrayal and the life she had ruined stayed with her always. As for David, the lover, he distanced himself quickly once he found out about the pregnancy. The thrill of a forbidden affair faded as fast as his willingness to commit, leaving Emily with yet another layer of heartache. In the end, John moved on a man scarred but not broken. He learned that some wounds never fully heal, but it's still possible to move forward despite them. His life would never be the same, but he found solace in accepting that not everything could be controlled. And so, the paths of John, Emily, and the child who would never be his diverged, each coping with the fallout of their decisions. Life, as always, continued, leaving behind the scars of a marriage shattered by infidelity and doubt. Now that this story has come to an end, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions about the outcome in the comments, and let us know if you were also impacted by how things turned out. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one, and hit the bell so you won't miss any new videos. Remember, here on the channel, we don't condone any form of betrayal, but we explore these stories to reflect on the complexities of human relationships. Until next time.